Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. Today I have on with me Steve Taylor. Steve is a registered dietitian. He works out of his own private practice based in LA, but also is the registered dietitian for Team 3DMJ Natural Bodybuilding Company. I had the pleasure of meeting Steve last July, I think it was, when I competed at one of my bodybuilding shows, and Steve is just an all-around awesome guy. He recently released, I think it was about a week ago at the time of recording, a course, How to Transition Away from Tracking, which was developed by himself and Dr. Eric Helms, which goes into how to move away from tracking your macronutrients. So this was what the topic of conversation was all about. So it's more geared towards people who perhaps have been tracking for a long time and don't know how to transition away from it, or perhaps haven't even thought about transitioning away from it. We talk about all the potential pitfalls of tracking for a long time, how you might be missing out by not actually tracking for a period of time, and then some of the associated problems when you actually track for too long. So we go into everything about tracking, and it was a great conversation. Personally, and also Steve, I know, has the same position that tracking isn't something that is inherently bad, and they talk a lot about this in the course that they released, and it is definitely a useful tool from time to time, but it isn't necessarily something that you want to be using all of the time for the rest of your life, and it isn't something that's going to create long-term sustainable habits for a healthy lifestyle. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a rating and review, and if you got any questions, you can reach out to myself. My email address, my social media handles, etc. are in the show notes. The same with Steve. If you've got any questions for him, you can reach out to him there, and you can also check out the new course that they have released over at 3DMJ. That will also be linked in the show notes. But without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Steve Taylor. It's good to chat to you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, when was that last one? Was it last summer? No.
I think the last time that we spoke was at the Muscle Mayhem. Oh, well, like, other than just like or Instagram or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or email. Yeah, so it's been a while. Have you been since then?
I've been good, man. I've been good. How about you?
Yeah, I've been good. Eating a lot more food, so feeling a lot better. It was a long season for me, contest prep wise. That was my first show, but I didn't finish my contest season until November, like 18th or something.
So you stayed in that condition from July all the way through November?
Well, I kind of had like unplanned diet breaks. So like the week after the Muscle Mayhem, I traveled to Lake Tahoe and I think San Francisco as well. So I didn't track anything, didn't try to go crazy, but like when you're such low levels of body fat, even if you think that you're being pretty smart about it, you pretty much always overeat. So, and then the same thing kind of happened after my second show in September. I was just like, I need a break from tracking and just, digging so hard. And yeah, and like I gained a couple pounds each time, but other than that, pretty much, yeah. So, it was long.
Yeah, I bet you feel a lot better now.
Yeah, I'm much heavier, like a lot heavier. So I actually didn't track anything since the day after the competition. I mean, I stayed with Eric and Alberto and Jeff in New York, and their wives were there. And the day after, we went to like some mall. I mean, Amityville, New York there's not much happening, but there was like some sort of mall there. And I think I ate like 1 kilo of sweets. Like it was at least 1 kilogram of sweets, like jellies. And from then I just pretty much didn't track anything. And obviously didn't track that because my fitness pal probably would have broke. But yeah, and I've enjoyed it actually. I enjoyed not tracking, and I think it was a really good part of my recovery, so to speak, physically and also more so mentally. I mean, obviously, just to get back to normal, to feeling normal again, I would have had to gain body fat. But I thought that one thing that I didn't do compared to previous times I competed, because it was funny, the last time I competed in 2016, I didn't realize or forgot completely that I messaged you on Instagram back then, because we both done the same organization, the WBFF, and that just came back to life when I messaged you like a few weeks ago.
I know.
But, yeah.
I read that. I was like, that's crazy. That's been 4 years.
Yeah. So after that show, I think I tracked, or at least I tried to track, and then probably unsuccessfully stuck to whatever macros I had, and then felt really bad about it. And probably did that for a couple of weeks before I just said, oh, fuck it. But this time I was just like, I'm not going to track anything. I'm just going to eat, try not to be over gluttonous. Like, I mean, eat what I want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I just eat like, you know, jars of peanut butter and squeezing honey into it all day. But I just ate what I want, and I gained kind of weight kind of fast, I guess, fast-ish. And at the start, I wasn't feeling that good. I mean, physically, because, you know, the thermic effect of food was I was just sweating a lot at nighttime. But then my weight sort of leveled out by the end of the calendar year, which was pretty much only like 5 weeks after I competed. And then ever since then, it's just remained the same. And I haven't been tracking anything. I mean, I'm eating enough protein. I'm trying to eat a good diet. But if I want something, then I'll have it. I mean, you know, within reason, like trying to eat like an adult. And my weight's just kind of halted. I mean, you know, it hasn't gone up much more at all. And I felt really good about it. I mean, I had like pretty much after the first few weeks, I had like no food focus whatsoever. Like, I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I need to finish this, or I can't wait to eat like another ice cream after I've already eaten one, or something like that. And I think that's something that I'll do in the future. I mean, I don't think that I would change anything per se necessarily. Like, yeah, I would like to be a little bit leaner, but I mean, now I'm 28. I don't really care that much if I've got abs still, or if I'm shredded still. I mean, if I'm feeling crap, you know, people don't really give a crap what I look like. And at the end of the day, I want to progress as a bodybuilder, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the topic of this conversation, I guess, to come back to it and not veer off too much, is all about tracking. So, you know, given that we started with that topic, and then more specifically, you know, transitioning away from tracking. So I know you released a course with Eric Helms recently. I think you released that last week, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I just finished up watching it, and it's a great course. And I got some questions for you around that. So first of all, because we actually recorded this or something similar, like July of last year, but I messed up with the whole editing, or I think my laptop completely died or something. It was a different laptop, so that never came to life. But now we're kind of starting at square one again. But for those who don't know who you are, give a quick introduction to yourself and what you do, and you know how you got involved in kind of bodybuilding.
Yeah, simply put, I'm a registered dietitian. I have my master's degree in dietetics, nutrition, and exercise physiology. And I have a consulting practice where I help people make sustainable behavior changes in regard to how they eat and how they move. And got involved in bodybuilding. Actually started, got into weight training through football, American football. From there, fell in love with weightlifting and just kind of fell into physique sport from there. And yeah, love physique sport. And started off, competed for 3 seasons and opened my practice. And then once I started working with other people, I realized that, hey, my passion is actually for helping people make these long-term sustainable changes to how they eat and how they move to improve their life. So I still work with a lot of competitors, a lot of physique athletes, a lot of powerlifters, but it's not so much getting them ready for the stage or the platform, but helping them to come either out of that place or how to learn to live in their off season in a non-obsessed way. This way they can, you know, have a normal life and still be a productive bodybuilder or a productive powerlifter.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of an area that's not necessarily talked about much. I mean, or at least it hasn't been in the past. I know when I was like growing up or younger, when I followed like bodybuilders, it was just always assumed that they just get fat, like really fat off season, and it's not necessarily that healthy. But what are some of the problems, or what are some of the things that we see after, say, contest prep? Because most of the information that we see online, people putting out, it's all about like getting in contest shape, or maybe it's not even contest shape, but like getting in photo shoot shape, or trying to lose fat, and you know, trying this diet, that diet, whether you think that's a good strategy or not. But what are some of the problems that can arise after, say, one has got into the shape that they've got into?
I think the biggest one, it all kind of stems from this, is just having no exit strategy. So it's like there's always a plan to the stage, but then there's never really a plan afterwards. And so typically that leads to, without the plan, it's either, well, I'll just keep doing what I was doing, which is eating not very much and, moving a ton, which just isn't sustainable, and then often leads to binging and everything like that. Or the plan, since they don't have one, is, well, I guess I'll just start, eating again with no structure. And then, weight is gained very rapidly. And then they start to feel bad about, heck, they worked so hard for this goal, and now they're just seeing it. They're moving away from that peak level of conditioning that they had so quickly, and because it wasn't a planned thing, there's a lot of guilt associated with that.
Yeah, and I think often when I'm like giving advice or like talking to people on this podcast as well, I almost need to give like an asterisk towards the advice that I give, because like myself or some of the people that I work with are like, they're competitive bodybuilders, or they get in a photo shoot shape, and that's the goal initially. It's not to try and get into bodybuilding shape and then stay there forever for the rest of their life, because I've been guilty of posting some things or some strategies that I've done during my prep to get my food volume up really high, and these, like, now that I think of it, this just absolutely disgusting combinations of foods, egg whites and like cottage cheese or whatever, and then you like whip it up in a mixer for like a half an hour, and it gets like really high volume with like gelatin and stuff, or xanthan gum, and I can't even think about that. It makes me feel ill to my stomach right now. But when people are like asking me, what's that recipe for that you're doing, and it's not necessarily a strategy that I would do to try and maintain a certain body weight for the rest of my life, or if I want to be healthy, because it's, in a sense, it's an unhealthy eating behavior. And I even felt myself that it's hard to distinguish between the two, but I don't consider myself having an eating disorder, because I don't binge, or I don't have any associations where I have an unhealthy relationship with food now. But when I do diet, I know towards the end of a long contest prep that I will binge, and it's not like something that I do all the time, but it's just something sometimes that I just can't control. So I think maybe I did it 2 or 3 times towards the end of my contest prep, and I think that's more, perhaps this is just the complete term that I've coined, is just disordered eating rather than an eating disorder, because once I've removed myself almost from that situation, and mainly a physiological situation where my body fat's just so low, I have like relative energy deficiency syndrome, because I'm just doing so much cardio and training, and I'm eating like a 120-pound woman, that when I've removed myself from that, then that kind of goes away. So I think when people, and you'll be able to talk to this better, but when people are like giving bodybuilding advice or what bodybuilders do for stages, it's not necessarily something that people can just pick up and apply to their own lives for long-term sustainable healthy habits.
Definitely, and you touched on a really good point there, because it's like either somebody who's a non-competitor, or if it's somebody who's a competitor and they're in their off season, it's let people know is like we shouldn't be having to do any really goofy eating behaviors to like maintain this thing. Like, for example, if somebody's trying to make long-term changes to how they eat, and they want to learn how to lose weight and keep it off for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, it's like, are they really going to have a 6-pound salad every night?
Yeah.
So it's like they shouldn't, or are they going to have like Walden Farms calorie-free stuff all the time? Or are they going to be, it's like if we're talking about like true sustainability, there shouldn't be any like wacky things going on.
Yeah, I got you. And I guess one of the things that people do when they trying to get into extreme shape, or maybe not even extreme shape, or perhaps just lose some body fat, would be initially tracking. And I can't, that's almost ubiquitous now within bodybuilding, at least in, say, quote unquote evidence-based bodybuilding, because of the calories in, calories out. People will now track their calories or the macronutrients in some form or another. But what are the potential downsides that can lead to, beyond, say, the contest prep? And I know that some people, like traditionally, let's say bodybuilders, if you follow Flex magazine, or even some of the IFBB pro bodybuilders now, they'll just follow a set diet. They don't necessarily count their macronutrients, but like they might reduce their serving size of peanut butter or potatoes, and by default they're reducing their carbs or their fats, but they're not necessarily tracking them. But now you'll get people who follow their macros, and they're trying to be a bit more flexible with the dieting, and they're saying hashtag like healthy dieting or flexible dieting, that it's more emotionally healthy, because you're not necessarily bastardizing one certain food or a group of macronutrients. And that works, and it's almost necessary if you want to have a flexible or restrained flexibility within your diet and still get into contest shape. It's very hard to just wing it and try and eat healthily, quote unquote, and get into contest shape. But have you seen, or what are the things that potentially tracking macros for a long time can lead to?
I mean, I could take this in so many directions. I guess I'll start with, okay. For one, this is something that I noticed, and it sounds maybe counterintuitive, but like, I feel that like over tracking, and Eric noticed this as well. It's like if you're continuing to track very precisely for a long period of time, what's kind of become popular over the years is like, if tracking is optimal, but actually like you might be limiting yourself in certain ways. It's like maybe you would perform better if you ate a little more on this certain day, but because you have these predetermined targets, you feel like you can only have so much food, and so you limit yourself, which means you have a worse training session. And so of course that's just one day, but let's say like over time you did that enough times to where it's like you consistently had like lower quality training sessions, that would start to impact the amount of muscle tissue you were building, which would ultimately impact what you're ultimately after, which is a better physique. So that's one example of like how it could get in the way. Because if you're relying too heavily on that external feedback and not listening to the feedback your body's giving you, you could be keeping yourself at a body composition that is suboptimal for building muscle, or suboptimal for your goals. And if you touch base a little more with yourself, your body could give you that feedback like, hey, I want to gain a little more weight. And then through doing that, you would see an increase in performance, an increase in muscle tissue, and then ultimately long term become a better physique athlete. Other things, which this is stuff that Eric's did a really good job of talking about in that course, is looking at the research on eating disorders and disordered eating, and how tracking can actually exacerbate that. How there's obviously eating disorders are multifactorial. There's a lot of things that go into that, but if you're constantly obsessing over all of these numbers, everything you eat, constantly weighing yourself, checking everything. I mean, just that alone of having those thoughts in your mind all the time, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, absolutely has an impact.
Yeah, and I think a good point that, I don't know if yourself or Eric made, that was that even if you don't perceive it to be overly stressful, it just perhaps means that you're good at dealing with stress and you're coping very well, rather than it not being an actual stressful event or activity that you're doing in your life. And I completely agree with you on the kind of body fat thing, and it comes back down to people trying to perhaps maintain a level of body fat that's perhaps too lean for them. Like for me, I look in the mirror and like, I don't even know if I really look like a bodybuilder anymore, to be honest. I maybe look like a rugby player or something like that. But I'm not pretty looking anymore. Not that I probably was that pretty, but I mean, my physique is not necessarily something that people would consider like a bodybuilder. But I know that where I am right now, like I'm feeling really good. I'm not trying to gain too much more weight because I'm playing basketball now again as well. But I feel that if I could easily have held 20 pounds or 15 pounds lighter and like looked more aesthetically pleasing. But I know that would have been detrimental to my performance, and I probably would have had to be a bit more meticulous with my tracking, meaning that I wouldn't have been able to listen to my internal cues of hunger and satiety and my activity levels per se, because that ultimately would have drove my overall intake up to get me ultimately to in and around where I am right now, body weight and body fat wise.
And that is one of the things that I think once you step away from tracking, once you step away from staring at all these predetermined targets, it makes it easier to get more in touch with the feedback your body's giving you. Because like if our focus is so heavy on here are my targets, here's what I need to hit and all this stuff, it's easy to like disregard or ignore what our body's telling us. But when we no longer have that safety net of like here are these targets, and we just it forces us to become more in tune with our body, which means then we're able to quickly recognize, actually I am hungry all the time, and I probably shouldn't be hungry all the time if I'm trying to build muscle.
Yeah, and I got you. And I guess, what we're talking here about is transitioning away from tracking. So there would have been some presumption that you would have tracked before, right? So if you're always listening to your feedback, your biofeedback, if that's even a real word, that, when you're in a dieting phase, there's going to be times when you're hungry. So do you think that this can actually work when you're in a fat loss phase, or is it more so to create a healthier relationship with food, or getting better in tuned with your feedback, the feedback that your body's sending you?
Yep, and as you said, so the it's all based around the assumption that the person has experience tracking, that they're very familiar with food, they're very familiar with the macronutrient composition of different foods, they have habits in place. And so all of that being said, you can cut, you can maintain, and you can gain without tracking. Like, absolutely. The kind of, as you touched on at the very beginning, the challenges occur. For example, you're talking about can somebody go through a fat loss phase without tracking? Absolutely. I do it all the time. I have plenty of clients who do it all the time. It's absolutely possible. The issues start happening is once you, like you were saying, once you're trying to get super lean, because then it just becomes really hard to not eat if you don't have like kind of a cap. Because that is the thing that the tracking does give you, is like the amount of nutrients, the amount of calories you need to take in to reach your goals. But if you're super hungry and you don't have that cap, it's easy to overshoot that. So yes, it's possible. However, if somebody's at the last weeks and they're trying to get ready for the stage, or the last couple of months, depending on how lean they are, that's when tracking would be a better route to go.
Yeah, gotcha. So let's say if I'm like a guy who's like 5'11" or whatever, and I'm 40 pounds overweight, and I'm saying, Steve, that I actually eat when I'm hungry, and like I'm 40 pounds overweight. So like you're telling me that I can eat when I'm hungry and I can still lose weight. It hasn't worked for me so far. So how would you address that situation? Because I guess there's a lot of people who, they eat when they're hungry, but perhaps, and this is probably something that I was a weak point or a blind spot for you in the past, that when I thought of, say, intuitive eating or eating based on your intuition, that people that would lead to like some people being obese, but those people perhaps eat not necessarily just when they're hungry, but they have poor relationships with food. They eat when they're emotionally stressed, or when they're sad or upset, or they make poor food choices, or they're in environments that are not conducive to healthy living or a healthy body weight, or maintaining a healthy body weight. So if somebody is they feel like they are eating just when they're hungry, they eat 4 or 5 times a day, but they're now overweight, how do you say, I guess you wouldn't say just eat when you're hungry, right?
No, my first step to that typically is like, hey, let's actually start with a period of tracking. Let's get you tracking your calorie intake, get you tracking your protein intake, some stuff like that, and let's see where you're actually at, and let's get you to establish some habits that support fat loss. And then once we have we have an idea of you need to eat around 2,500 calories, and now we have like these 4 square meals a day. Each of those meals is giving you some protein, a fruit or a veggie. Then once we have that structure in place, then I would take away the tracking. So in that example, if like somebody was 40 pounds overweight and they're like, hey, I eat when I'm hungry, I stop when I'm full, I would say, okay, well, let's use tracking. Let's use tracking because maybe they're doing that, but maybe they don't know a ton about food. So maybe they are eating when they're hungry and stopping when they're full, but because they don't know a ton about food, the foods they're eating are very high calorie foods, very low in micronutrients, very low in fiber. And so the process of tracking can actually be a great process for learning about food. And so that's why even I think probably 3 to 4 times throughout that course that Eric and I created, we say like, hey, like we're not anti-tracking. Like tracking is extremely valuable. It teaches us a ton of information about food, teaches us a lot about our body. It helps us set up a good structure. So there's a lot of amazing things that come from tracking. The point of that course is like, okay, like just like training wheels, it's like once you kind of have that structure, you don't need to track anymore. But it is great.
Yeah, I got you. So you're not against actually somebody using some sort of tracking tool, and would that be writing down a food log, or do you use certain apps for people to track their food, and do you recommend that they do everything straight away, like 7 days a week, every meal, or what?
I mean, it depends on the situation and the person. I mean, honestly, like when I'm first starting with someone, especially if it's someone who's let's say they've never tracked before. And I realize this is about getting away from tracking. We're talking about tracking, but it's because it's like the reason you get away from tracking is because you don't need it anymore. You have the habits in place, like you're achieving the results you want to achieve. And so at this point, you just don't need tracking. But, to get away from tracking, first you can learn the things that tracking gives you. And so back to what you're saying, if I'm working with someone who's never tracked before, they don't have any, healthy habits, they don't know a lot about food, the first week before I ever onboard them into my program, I just have them keep a simple food diary without even using an app. They can just write down what they eat, about how much they ate, and the time they ate it. And so it's a very it's not like a super precise way of tracking where it's like they go from not tracking to like all of a sudden needing to like track their specific carbs and fats and proteins and all that crazy stuff. It's just like a very loose, like, hey, like what time did you eat? What did you have? About how much of it did you have? And just that simple process alone, it's amazing, when people come back to me and like, wow, I learned so much. I realized I was snacking all the time, or wow, I can't believe I'm eating like that. Because I think what happens is we just get so, we get habituated to stuff. And once stuff becomes a habit, we don't even see it anymore. And so what that process does of like keeping a food journal or using a food tracking app is it starts to make us aware of our habits. And then, once we have that awareness, it's like, oh shoot, no wonder I'm 40 pounds overweight. Like, and that awareness alone is extremely powerful.
Yeah, I think like sometimes it's often hard for me to conceptualize that, because I tracked for so long that when I moved away from tracking, and it wasn't that I was something that was constraining me. I was like, I'm not going to track anymore. And I did, like you mentioned, that sometimes they'll feel fearful or they'll feel really regretful when they move away from tracking but gain a lot of weight. When I told you that I moved away from tracking and I gained weight, that I wasn't, one bit upset. I mean, like, when your physique fades, you do have sometimes you just, you're a bit sad. You have a little cry here and there. But I mean, I wasn't like depressed, or I wasn't down about myself, or wasn't self-loathing because my physique was now putting on body fat. I knew that my goal was to actually put on body fat, and I wasn't like curious or confused as to why I was gaining body fat now, even though I was only eating to where I was full, because I knew that I was eating more calorie dense foods. I knew I was eating more nut butters. I was eating out, more frequently, like twice as much as I had been previously, if not more. And I was, not necessarily always eating as much high volume foods, but only from tracking for, a number of years periodically, that I was able to, understand that. And, if I want to actually lose body fat now, which I don't right now, but if I did, all I would do is swap back in, perhaps higher calorie or lower calorie density foods, more high volume foods, like perhaps more vegetables, or just, choose different options of carb sources, or whatever it may be, and not necessarily feel hungry or even any way more hungry than I am right now.
Mm-hmm. And that's a fascinating thing, because I've seen this with myself, and I've seen it happen with countless people. And that is like, okay, let's say like when somebody gets away from tracking, oftentimes their appetite actually goes down, even if they're eating the same amount of calories, or even if their calories go down. Because there's something about that where it's like, if I know I have 2,000 calories that I can't eat, and I've only had 1,800, like, it's like that psychological, like, okay, like I'm still hungry because I still have 200 calories left. I'm obviously still hungry because I know that. But it's like, if I didn't know I'd only had 1,800 calories, I might be full, I might be good, or I might have stopped at 16, which is like, I see that happen all the time. And I think it's just like, yeah, it's just something about like knowing that like this is the amount that I need to eat, and knowing that I'm under that, I must be still hungry. And so it's like, then our psychology starts to affect our physiology, and so then we start feeling hungry, and then all of a sudden our behaviors are different. Now we're going to eat something that, heck, if we just didn't know the numbers, we might have stopped.
Yeah, that completely makes sense, because even now when I'm not tracking at all, I find that some evenings I'm like, I'm happy if like, I'm not happy, but I'm not, I'm not disappointed or like worried if I don't, is a better word, if I don't like eat enough food, because I have pretty big appetite anyway. But sometimes I realize that towards the end of the day, it's like, oh, I've only had like 2 sittings of protein today, and I'm probably on less than like 100 grams or whatever, and I'm like, oh, I'm not hungry whatsoever. But if I was tracking, I probably would have been hungry, because I would have realized that have eaten like 2,500 calories or whatever calories for that day. And I monitor my body weight every single day, simply just because I have this Fitbit scales that you just stand on it and just tracks it straight to your app. So it's pretty much no, there's no effort barriers or whatever. And I don't even like write it down. I just look at it every once a month and just see the trend. And I noticed that like some days I'm like lighter, and I'll feel a little bit more hungry that day. And then if I'm heavier one day, because I've eaten a lot the night before or whatever, maybe I'll just eat a little bit less. And often when I'm making food choices personally, like let's say I eat a big lunch with like a ton of calories and a ton of carbs, maybe later that day I might be hungry, but if I know I've eaten a lot of food, I might say, well, maybe I'll just have an extra serving of vegetables instead of having the rice, because I know they're both going to fill me up equally as much. They're going to have the same satiety effect, but one of them has quite a bit more calories, and I wouldn't have known that if I had never ever tracked before. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And isn't it nice being able to just, say, hey, I don't want the rice, let me just have some veggies, without having to like get way down in the weeds and be like, okay, let me weigh out the spinach, weigh out the onions, weigh out the tomatoes, weigh out the mushrooms. Like, isn't it nice just being able to be like, okay, I need to cut my calories down, let me just eat some veggies instead of rice, and keeping it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is, because you mentioned about eating a sandwich, not having to count the calories or whatever. And it's not that it even takes that long. I mean, it may take you an extra minute or two, but there's just something behind it mentally that's like, oh, I've got to weigh it, I've got to chop it up and put it on a plate, and then I've got to like just like get the ham and cheese and the butter and the lettuce, whatever, and put it on the sandwich and just eat it, and then like not worry about it. And yeah, it's just kind of refreshing sometimes not to have to track like that. And yeah, I think it definitely can limit you. I've noticed, not necessarily with myself, but with some people that I've worked with in the past, that it can hold them back when they go out to eat, because even if they're not like say in a dieting phase, which is a bodybuilding comp prep phase, which is kind of different, but they'll not eat, or they'll say like they'll feel good about not eating certain things because they didn't want to go over the calories. And it comes back to your point about like the performance. Like some days you are just hungrier because we move more, or if we're studying more, we can burn more calories, or if we're training harder, or our body just needs more calories for recovery someday. It's like calories is almost, or macronutrients and tracking macronutrients are almost just the best guess some of the times,
Mm-hmm. And back to the eating out point, it's like, I mean, I think sometimes we just get so focused on bodybuilding, but like if this is really going to turn into like something that we do as like a lifelong sport, like are we really not going to eat out ever again? Like, are we really not going to like have date nights or go out with friends, or if something comes up, are we really just going to like not eat because we don't know the exact nutrient breakdown of what we're having? I mean, that's an option, but that's not the way that I wanted to do it. And a lot of the people that I work with, they're tired of that lifestyle, and they want to learn how to do this stuff in a way that they can still stay on track with their goals, but also live life.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point that if you've never tracked before, it's often hard to understand your signals, or why you eat before, or maybe it's just because you don't have the background knowledge or references to to give you insight into why right now you're perhaps not at the body composition that you want to be. But with bodybuilders specifically, or people who do physique sports, I know myself, and perhaps just the type of person who's drawn towards it. They're quite over analytical, and they want to optimize everything and try and push, for maximal progress and kind of tick all the boxes. Especially with natural bodybuilding, I think, because you have such a small playing field, a room to grow, so to speak. With enhanced bodybuilding, you can kind of do a lot of stuff and get away with it because you've got assistants. But with natural bodybuilding, there's only ever so much that you can grow in terms of your muscles. So it's almost like you have to be optimal in the later part, or even beyond the first few years of your weight training career, to make that incremental process. So if somebody, let's say they just came out of a dieting phase or a contest prep phase, and they do feel a bit restrained or controlled or confined by the macros, but they're afraid of moving away from tracking, because they want to make sure that they're only in like 100 calorie surplus or a 200 calorie surplus. And I even see this with like bodybuilders who are quite successful, so to speak, or have a big following, that they're giving their like, oh, on my training days I'm eating these macros, and my off days I'm eating these macros because I want a 200 calorie surplus only, and it can kind of create a bit of fear within people who are perhaps not quite there, but want to get to that position. So how would you advise somebody who wants to move away from it but is afraid? Like, what are the first steps? So they're tracking 7 days a week, they track everything, all their macros, all the way down to the Splenda that they eat. How do they move away from it successfully and not turn into like Mr. Blobby or whatever?
I think the first thing I would say is like, that's exactly what that course was created for. So it's like, if somebody like really wants to go through that process, I would check out that transitioning away from tracking course, because Eric hits the research hard, and then I come through with the actual practicality, like a step-by-step process. How do you do this?
So Eric hits the first blow, and you come in and get the slight digs at the end.
So he does a really good job. I mean, his research that he covers is phenomenal, and I think it addresses a lot of the concerns that people have about tracking being optimal, and if I'm not tracking, I'm not being optimal. He makes it clear that it's not the case. So back to your example, the first steps that someone can take. I mean, it really depends on I guess I always go back to like, it depends on like where they're at and what the person, whatever. But the first step of, let's say, getting away from tracking is just getting away from tracking. So it's like, typically, like before I have someone transition away, it's like I make sure that they have some sort of like eating structure. They have habits that support their health and goals. And so if somebody doesn't yet have that structure, it's like maybe stick with tracking for another week or two to set up that structure. And then once they have that structure, then keep that structure, but just don't track it anymore. So it's like eat similar foods at similar times and similar portions. Make the very first step just not tracking anymore. Because just because you're not tracking it anymore, that doesn't mean anything in reality is actually changing. I mean, your diet might look the exact same. And of course, all of this is around the fact of like, let's say somebody's in a good spot to transition away. So for example, let's say somebody finishes a show and they feel like just totally stepping away would be too much and they would really go off the rails and binge. Well, it's like, yeah, then maybe you gradually get away from it. So again, but in this example, we're just saying like, hey, the person, they're in a good spot. They feel like they can handle it. What's the first step? The first step is like, have your structure, stick to your structure at first, and then just get away and get used to not tracking. And then once you get more comfortable with not tracking, then you can start to vary your eating behaviors more, vary your food choices more, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there might have been a 3DMJ blog post about it before. It's something I've been kind of doing for a long time myself. And it's not just, for the reason of tracking, but just for convenience sake. It was like having an almost a meal plan, but more just the bones of a meal plan. So like eat oats and whey protein for breakfast, or eat Greek yogurt before bed, and then like during the day eat like vegetables and a protein source from animals, and that was kind of it, and maybe one snack. And I think that's probably what most of the normal people do who don't like bodybuilding or training. They just eat similar foods every day. Maybe they eat cornflakes for breakfast, but they don't have like a protein source. But they'll eat very similar meals most days. And then often when people get into the physique sports, they kind of overcomplicate it. And then when they learn about flexible dieting, it means that you almost have to be flexible and change your foods every single time you eat something and make up all these different meals from the macros that you have, rather than just saying, well, let's keep the bones of a meal plan, whether it be just like I'm going to have some form of eggs and then changing some of the vegetables or carb sources or fat sources. And I think that's what really, would help people, or at least has helped me. I think Eric called it the default diet or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I guess, is that what you're talking about? Like keeping some form of structure that way, and then once you've kind of got comfortable with that, adding in then additional foods or swapping out certain foods.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, yeah, like you said, that's exactly the structure I'm talking about. It's like, maybe you have, you eat around like 10 and 2 and 6 and 10 or something like that. And you kind of know, okay, like you said, here's I have some protein there, I have a fruit or a veggie there, and I have, a good portion of carbs there. And you just kind of start with that structure, like what you've been doing. Because I found that like most people, not everyone, but a lot of people, once we're like tracking, like most of us, just because we have jobs and other things in life, like we have to create some sort of structure because of our schedule. And so typically like we're already doing something. And so like I said, the first step is like just keep doing what you're doing, just don't record the numbers anymore. And that's a good first step, because like a lot of it is just like getting comfortable. It's like basic. It's not exposure therapy, but it's like, it's basic, like, hey, like you're afraid of this thing, like let's just ease into it. First, let's just get comfortable not tracking. And then once you see that actually I'm good, it's not that scary, I'll be okay, then you start, okay, maybe I want to change and change up my meal timing a little bit, or maybe I want to have some different foods or some stuff like that. As you start to see like, okay, I can do this, it's not that big of a deal, it's not that scary, I'll be fine.
Is that what you would call intuitive eating, or is that something different?
That's something different, just because like this, like what in the context of what we're talking about, physique athletes and powerlifters. I mean, we're eating for specific, like sport specific outcomes, and so we're not just eating based on our body's feedback. So we are using either like our training as our guidance, or our body weight, or physique pictures. Like we're still using external feedback to guide our decision making, which doesn't make it true intuitive eating. So it's not the exact same, but what we are doing is we're incorporating, paying more attention to the feedback our body's giving us, which is something that I know at least for me, like when I first started tracking, like no one ever told me to pay attention to how I'm feeling, to pay attention to like how hungry or full I am, or how my energy, my mental clarity, my digestive functioning was going. There was no talk about that. It was like, here's your protein, here's your fat, here's your carb targets. I don't care how you hit that, just make sure before you go to sleep you hit those targets. And that was okay and that worked, but since incorporating all this other stuff, and paying attention to like my body's feedback, it actually has resulted in better results, which was the reason behind, Eric and I creating this course is tracking itself, doesn't necessarily make it more optimal. I mean, back to our, like what we very first started on, it's like what might be, quote unquote more optimal is if you gain 10 pounds. But because you're so focused on hitting these targets, you're preventing yourself from gaining the 10 pounds. But once you move away from having that safety net of that anchor of having those targets, you're forced to touch base with your body more. And then you're able to recognize, like, shoot, I'm hungry all the time. I shouldn't be hungry all the time. I need to eat more. That's one example. And the other example I gave was the performance thing. Is like if you cap yourself to, I can only have 200 carbs today, but like maybe you were super active. And maybe if you ate 300, you would have a phenomenal training session. And like that's going to result in, obviously, like, if you do that over time, it's going to result in more muscle growth. Like that's another example of where tracking would actually be suboptimal, because it would keep you at a lower nutrient intake, where if you just ate a bit more, you would perform better.
Yeah, I think I've personally experienced some some situations like that. Like I mentioned at the start, I started playing basketball again. Hadn't played in years, and I haven't been tracking, but I know that some days I actually go to the gym in the morning and then play basketball at nighttime, and I just feel like I gotta eat a lot more carbs that day, and because I'm tired, or I'm gonna burn way more calories playing basketball for an hour or 2 hours than I would if I was just training. But if I was confining myself to 200 or 300 or whatever it is grams of carbohydrates, then yeah, it may affect my basketball performance, but I pretty much play, semi-recreationally, so it wouldn't be that important. But my goal of building muscle would be impaired, and that's pretty important to me. And I think, like, about a month ago, I was in Rome, in Italy, and I remember I was walking around and was just doing a ton of walking. I never experienced this, but I got I started feeling really, really weak and started sweating a ton, and I think it was hypoglycemia. Like, I never experienced it before, but I had to pound back 200 grams of carbs from sports drinks and bread rolls and stuff, just to feel like I wasn't gonna die. And if I had been on a diet or something like that, and I was so restrictive with the calories, or so confined with the calories that I had, I might have been oh no, I gotta push through. And even when I was doing prep, that was almost the mentality that I was in as well. I was if I'm feeling tired or hungry, it's a good sign that I'm losing fat. And yeah, I have a little bit more awareness because I've been doing it for so long. But perhaps people who aren't thinking about the broader scope, or thinking more critically, or evaluating in the grand scheme of things, they might have not had some carbs, and it might have just felt like crap for the whole day.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody's transitioning away, and they've been they've been hungry for a whole prep, and you've got them eating this more structured plan, how do they start to incorporate foods that perhaps are not going to make them gain a ton of weight? Do you track their weight or do you recommend that they track their weight for a while? Because I was listening to some podcasts and stuff like that, reading a bit about intuitive eating, and I know, like you said, that it's not necessarily the same thing. Because of this whole diet stigma and this anti-diet movement within the general population, because there seems to be some weight stigma around people who are overweight, that they need to lose weight, that everyone's just pushing back against diet, and that you don't need to track anything, or that you should just be in tune with your body and eating that way. How do you recommend that people start to eat foods that are perhaps more satiating if they're, say, gaining weight faster? Or do you track their body weight on a daily basis, or do you recommend that's something they do? Because ultimately our goal may not necessarily be weight neutral, it might be to gain weight or to gain muscle.
Yeah, and that is where, okay, so it's if you have your structure, the other thing, and you have your goal set, what you're trying to achieve. It's you have some sort of system to monitor how things are going. So that is where, and again, that's what makes this not true intuitive eating. One of the things is you are using some sort of external feedback to guide your decision making. So it's maybe you're a bodybuilder and you're in your off season and you're trying to gain between 1 to 3 pounds per month. Well, yeah, maybe you're trying to, let's say, get stronger as well. Maybe you track your body weight 4+ times per week, and you do that for a couple of weeks, a month. You see how that's going. You track your training, you're ensure you're getting stronger, and if you notice you're not gaining as quickly as you'd like, that's where there's a lot of things you could do. Ultimately, you need to get in more calories, but that's where you could do simple stuff like adding in another snack, adding in another meal, aiming to be a bit more full at each meal, and the opposite. Let's say you're gaining weight a little too quickly. That's where you could take away a snack, or aim to be a little less full at each meal, or start swapping protein sources. Maybe you move from higher fat protein sources to lower fat protein sources, and do simple food modifications, substitutions like that. In terms of introducing how do you eat higher calorie foods and work that stuff in, I would say there's not really an exact process for that. It's kind of just part of the whole thing. It's you have your structure, you get your protein, your fruits and your veggies. Because you've tracked for so long, you know about where your calories need to be, and you know about how many you've had that day. And so you know whether, you want to eat some more calories that day or not. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The thing that I guess people would be fearful of would, I guess you're going to give some form of structure or guidelines, or at least teach them through that period where they're not just saying, well, off you go now, you kind of eat until you're hungry or when you're full, and then just eat whatever you want. You got some guidelines around eating vegetables and protein at each meal or a couple of times a day, and making sure that you're eating a healthy diet. But when it comes to things that are food specifically that are, say, quite calorie dense and don't have much or have less impact on your hunger than, say, more voluminous foods like fruits and vegetables, how do people, I guess you said there's not an exact way to introduce those into their diet. Would it be that they include that on top of their diet, or they swap certain foods? Because you can get some foods that are pretty dense in calories, but you may not actually be full even eating that food or that meal, like a 1,000-calorie burger, but you're still kind of hungry after it.
Yeah, and I think the reason I was maybe struggling to articulate that is because it's like, when I think about one day, the whole point of this thing is we're not needing to be as precise anymore. So it's like earlier we were talking about, at the end of a contest prep, this whole thing of not tracking might not be the best approach, just because the level of precision with where your calories need to be, where your protein needs to be, it's so tight. You can't afford to be off. But if somebody's in a gaining phase and they're trying to gain 2 to 4 pounds a month, 1 to 3 pounds per month, if they have an extra 1,000 calories one day, it just doesn't matter. It just ends up balancing out. And so that's why I'm I'm trying not to get too nitpicky, where it's okay, here's this strategy, here's what you do if you want to have this food on this day, and here's what you want to do if you have this, because it's it shouldn't need to be that particular. You shouldn't have to be micromanaging things that closely in this kind of phase. It's okay, you track for so long, you know a lot about food, you know kind of where your calories need to be. It's you can't, maybe you can, but in this example, let's say you're somebody who can't have a 1,200 calorie burger every night. So it's you just know from your experience and from your knowledge, I can't eat a 1,200 calorie burger every night. That won't work. But if you do it once a week or twice a week or whatever, you're not dealing with that same level of okay, I can only have X amount of calories, and if I don't, I'm not going to hit my target. Because the whole thing about this system as well is if you overeat, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, it's if you overeat for a few days, if you're in a range where your body likes to be and you're in tune with the feedback your body's giving you, if you overeat for a few days, typically what I've seen with myself, what I've seen with clients, what Eric's noticed, and I assume I'm curious to hear how it's been for you, is if you're in a good spot physiologically and you overeat for a few days, typically the subsequent days, the couple days after that or the day after that, you're just naturally not as hungry. And so you will automatically drop your calorie intake the next day without having to force it and without having to freak out, being oh no, I had that, now I gotta have all these high volume foods, and there doesn't need to be that kind of managing going on.
I think you're dead right. I mean, the point you've touched on there is that this is for people who have experienced with tracking, so that means that they're not going to be blind to what's the calories and the macronutrients in a donut versus a lean beef patty. Are they going to be any different? It's not a question that you'd even have to ask yourself, because you got that experience, and it's not like you're unknowingly eating an extra 4,000 calories a day and didn't think about it. So it's important that in the context of this, that doing some form of tracking initially, whether that means macronutrient tracking or portion tracking or something, will give you a great baseline to be able to set up your meal plan or your structure or whatever in a way that you're still eating in tune with your goals, so to speak. And with regards to the question you've asked me about how do I feel with my hunger, etc., and has it changed? Yeah, it definitely has. Like I said, some days I spend a lot more calories based off of just my activity levels, playing some sports, and then also lifting. And the next morning, like I'll be hungry, you know, even at this body weight that I'm at, that I'll still be, you know, quite hungry. I'll eat some, like, you know, all brand cereal and have a shake or whatever. But other days when I'm like today, I didn't go to the gym. Probably won't go to the gym after this because it'll be too late. But I'm not gonna. I pretty much, my activity is low, so I'm not even that hungry. Like I might have a shake later and some fruit, or I might just have like a a small meal. And I know tomorrow I'm probably not going to be that hungry in the morning. And some days I overeat. Like I got a takeaway. I think the first time in, like, I don't know, maybe since I was like a kid, I bought fish and chips. It's pretty popular here. I just thought I'd try it, and the next morning I wasn't hungry at all. I just had a shake, and I guess it comes back to, like, you need to be in that body fat range, or your settling point, so to speak, which for some people means they can stay really lean, and for others they may need to get a little bit heavier than they would like in terms of body fat. But once you're in that spot, then I think that's when your body really starts to, you know, give you the correct hunger signals. I mean, or the correct response to food and to satiety and hunger, but only necessarily when you're in that body range. So, like, I'm gonna probably stay within this body fat range because I'm not, you know, overly hungry. I'm not gonna overeat, because when I start to push up my weight a little bit more, if my body fat gets a little bit higher, my hunger signal just dampens quite a bit, and I'll eat less, and I'll naturally fall back to a little bit leaner. But if I get too lean, then I'll just be hungrier a lot more often.
That's really well said. And because, like you said, if we're not talking about somebody who's like 6% body fat and they're starving, because it's like us then trying to be like, how do they eat in a way to, like, maintain that while having these different foods? It's like the whole, we're not even talking about the right thing. The first step is, like, they just need to gain weight. It shouldn't be like, how can they maintain 6% without tracking and eating these high calorie foods? Like, we're asking the wrong question. The first thing is, let's just get back to, like, where your body wants to be. And then, like you said, like, once you're there, you know, our bodies are amazing, and, like, they give us feedback, and we'll, like, as long as we're attuned to that, like, their body will give us guidance on, you know, to eat more, to eat less, and things like that. And there's a few things off of that. Again, it's not saying that's the only thing you listen to, because, you know, this whole conversation has been in the context of someone who is a physique athlete, or someone who wants to improve their body composition and do this for a sport, which means that, you know, maybe they do need to get above where their body wants to be, which is why they have that system, that monitoring system, to ensure that they're gaining weight. This way, you know, if their body is like, I don't want you to gain weight, I don't want you to gain weight, you know, they have a system outside of themselves to help them, you know, push beyond what their body wants to do, so that way they can gain the weight for their sport specific outcomes.
I think I'm kind of lucky in a way that I don't have I don't have a trouble gaining weight if I want to, and I don't actually want to gain any more weight. But I know that I've got some clients that are, like, probably 30 to 40 pounds lighter than me, and eat probably 1,000 more calories, and they struggle to gain weight, and they struggle to get all the calories in it. And if they were just to eat based off their hunger signals, they would probably remain pretty lean. And I guess because it comes back to the point that even natural bodybuilding may not necessarily be, you know, absolutely optimally healthy, trying to push your body weight above where it naturally wants to be, right? If you're going to be naturally slim, then, you know, perhaps you'll be at optimal health if you do remain naturally slim, rather than trying to push your weight up. And it's kind of a bit off topic, but I think some people think that, you know, weight training is healthy, so that means that if I'm benching 100 kilos for 10 reps, that if I can bench 150 kilos for 10 reps, I'll be healthier, which isn't necessarily the case, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything, like you said, you know, typically a little bit is good, but too much of anything can be, you know, have other impacts. So it's like, you know, if somebody's doing, you know, too lean, you know, obviously, like, being a healthy body fat is good, but if you're too lean, you know, typically there's a lot of, maybe not always physiological negative side effects. Of course, there can be once you get super lean, but, like, even just, like, the psychological, like, now you're just constantly thinking about food, you're isolating yourself, you're not hanging out with people, that kind of stuff. So it's like you said, you can take anything in training or nutrition to the extreme and have negative side effects.
Yeah. So just to wrap up then, I guess if you want to transition away from tracking, the first thing you really want to think about is getting to that body fat percentage or body weight that is going to be naturally healthy for you, and within that context, that is going to be optimal for you, even if you're a physique athlete, to gain maximum amount of muscle, because they often go hand in hand. Your hormones are at their best. It's often when you're at your healthiest, right? So if you're trying to stay too lean, perhaps, then this may not work perfectly for you, trying to move away from tracking until you get to that body fat percentage. And then for those who are really trying to push the envelope and gain more weight than they're naturally comfortable with, it may not work 100% correctly for them, or perhaps they'll need to implement some additional strategies like tracking their weight, or perhaps monitoring their food intake somehow.
Yeah, and if I was to add two things to that, I would say, like, the whole thing is like, in this phase, like, a lot of the fear comes around from, like, just thinking that somebody, like, we need to be super precise all the time. And, like, the whole point with all of this, like, even back to your question, how does somebody bring in these different foods and all that, is like, we're just in a phase. Our goals at that time just don't require that high level of precision. So therefore, like, being less precise is not sacrificing optimality. Like, we just don't, it wouldn't be any more beneficial to be more precise at that point for those goals.
Gotcha.
Yep. And the second thing, like you said, the transitioning away and getting away. It's the structure is a big deal. Just having that structure set up, having the habits in place, and then again, like, having is that way it's not just habits. Because I don't want someone to just do this and then assume, like, okay, I'm eating based on how I feel, this means things are going well. There has to be that component we've talked about probably 2 or 3 times now, which is like, there has to be that monitoring system, which is like, if you do have specific goals, that are outside of what your body wants to do naturally, then you do have to have some sort of monitoring system, weighing yourself, tracking your training, physique pictures. You have to have some sort of system to give you feedback, to let you know if these habits, if the way that you're eating is taking you to where you want to be. This way it's not just like, okay, let me just trust this whole thing is working, and 2 years from now I'll check to see if it actually worked. Like, I set aside a time, once a month to review, okay, am I gaining weight at the rate I want to? Is my strength going up appropriately? Is my physique changing the way I want it to? Set aside a specific time, like, create your game plan, and then work that game plan for, like, say, a solid month, and then review, am I achieving the outcomes I'm after? And then from there you can make adjustments.
Awesome, man. So Steve, where can people find more about you and your work?
Yeah, social media is Steve Taylor RD, and website is stevetaylorrd.com, and email address is steve@stevetaylorrd.com. So pretty simple.
And you just released the course?
Yes, and you can find that at 3DMJ Vault, and the course is called Transitioning Away from Tracking. Yeah,
and there's actually I think there's a free, like, intro, or a few of the modules are, like, free, that you can check that out before you actually even sign up for it, right?
Oh yeah, you get, I think it's 2 to 3 videos for free, a lot of information about the course. Eric gives a really good summary of what the course is about, what's contained in the course. So yeah, you get a lot, you can get a good feel for the course before you actually have to buy it.
Yeah, and it's only like $18 anyway, so pretty cheap. But Steve, thanks a lot, man, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
So there you have it. You can see that tracking, or I hope you've learned that tracking isn't necessarily something that you need to be married to all of your training or lifting career, or even something that's perhaps necessary to do all the time. I personally tracked, I think, the first time in 2009, which was 11 years ago now at this stage, and I found it to be a very, very valuable tool, but there was some limitations that we've spoke about that I definitely experienced personally and have experienced with the clients that I've worked with as well. And now, like I mentioned, I don't track at all, but because of the habits that I built up through tracking for such a long time, I'm able to now eat more mindfully, so to speak, without necessarily being so tied to strict numbers, and perhaps even optimizing my nutrition by not actually tracking. But if you want to learn more about this, I do recommend that you go over and check out that course. I have no affiliation to it at all. Just feel like it's a very good course for a very, very reasonable price. And I really trust and have a lot of respect for the guys over at 3D Muscle Journey, being a client of one of those for the past number of years. So check that out. Also, there's associated literature if you want to read that into more in depth into the studies that they speak about within that course, or some of the things that myself and Steve talk about. And if you do have any questions specifically around this, or you want to ask questions specifically around tracking and how you perhaps can move away from it, you can reach out to myself, or you can reach out to Steve. All of the contact details are down in the show notes again. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please leave a 5-star rating or review, or if you thought it was crap, leave a 1-star rating. Whatever, just some sort of rating would be pretty helpful and appreciated. But until the next time, I will chat to you then.